What we looked at in the last video was worldviews and how worldviews can be built up from theories. And as we're leaning towards exploring Irish mythology, in here what I want to be looking at is different forms of literary criticism, right? So different ways of looking at literature, or even media like movies, now that we have that technology and ability, right? So this is from the Britannica, and it says that literary criticism is the reasoned consideration of literary works and issues. It applies as a term to any argumentation about literature, whether or not specific works are analysed. Plato's cautions against the risky consequences of poetic inspiration in general in his Republic are thus often taken as the earliest important example of literary criticism. Important contributions to literary understanding have meanwhile been drawn from anthropology, linguistics, philosophy, and psychoanalysis. So there's an abundance of material there for us when we hope to engage with a piece of written work, or even, again, as I said, the media. I'm going to fly through these as well because there's no need to dwell on them in any real depth. They speak for themselves, right? So the first on the chopping block, so to speak, is the historical or biographical criticism. And I hope people don't take the word criticism as a total rejection and a kind of just throwing dirt on a topic. Instead, it's a picking it apart, picking it up, having a look at it, right? Looking at it in different ways or through different lenses. So the historical biographical criticism examines literature through the perspective of the author's historical context, right? So what was life like at the time this person was writing? This approach assumes that the significance of a particular piece of literature is inextricably linked to its historical context. For example, historical biographical critics evaluate Shakespeare's work within the context of English literature, and many stop there, right? But there's other lenses, there's other ways of examining Shakespeare's works, and anyone else's really, and culture during the late 16th, early 17th centuries. Yeah. So this lens will offer us up information, or lead us to information about the way the world was at the time this writing occurred, right? And these definitions or explanations of these different forms of criticism I got from a masterclass, which is it was a great little page that highlights a lot of these different perspectives. So next we have the moral or philosophical criticism, and these are in no particular order either. The first one doesn't outweigh the second one or anything like that. It's the way they're placed, right? So moral or philosophical criticism. This literary criticism style approaches literature based on its ethical merits. Moral philosophical critics evaluate literary works based on the moral statements and judgments the characters and author express throughout the literary text. So we went from a historical lens where we look at the times in which this manuscript or which this writing took place and what that tells us about the world and maybe the author as well. And now we can examine based on the text itself, not what was going on external to it, but based on what is in the text itself, the choices and the decisions that each character makes, and what sort of values are espoused or demeaned in the text. So we're fleshing out our understanding of, it could be the one book or the one story, right? But we're approaching it from different perspectives, which yields a far richer understanding, a tapestry, if you will, of understanding that text. And perhaps an example of the moral or philosophical perspective is one that is probably known to all, right? And this is Aesop's Fables. And I pulled this from Wikipedia because I use Wikipedia as it can stand as a good reference for what the current or average understanding on the topic is, right? As with any source, there can be limitations to it, but in this case, there's nothing controversial said here that I'm aware of, at least. And I also use it to show that we're not on untraveled ground here when we speak of there being many different ways to interpret a text or a given real world event or situation. Okay, these different perspectives, they're commonly known, right? If maybe little understood or little interacted with, but they're known to people, right? So we all know that Aesop's Fables deliver a morality, right? So we read a little bit about it. And again, this is from Wikipedia. You can go and look it up yourself and read it if you like. So the fables were part of an oral tradition and were not collected until about 3 centuries after Aesop's death. And the next is a quote from Apollonius of Tyana, who was a 1st century in the Common Era philosopher. And interestingly enough, I think there's theories that the story or the mythology of Jesus Christ was based on this man. But be that as it may, his quote is, "Like those who dine well off the plainest dishes, he made use of humble incidents to teach great truths. And after serving up a story, he adds to it the advice to do a thing or not to do it. Then, too, he was really more attached to the truth than the poets were, for the latter do violence to their own stories in order to make them probable. But he, by announcing a story which everyone knows not to be true, told the truth by the very fact that he did not claim to be relating real events." Interesting. We can add a sociological criticism to this as well, and this is probably the most in vogue form of criticism that we have, along with another handful of ones that kind of stemmed from this, right? So sociological criticism evaluates literature based on its relationship to society. The sociological criticism method examines the author's status in their society, as well as the effect that the literary work had on its audience within the society. One form of sociological criticism is Marxist criticism, which examines how a specific work of literature affirms or rejects oppression within class systems. And for anybody who's been paying attention over the last few years, or who has been to college, particularly the humanities departments in colleges, you'll be well aware of this form of criticism, right? So what can be observed in academia over the last number of decades is that a number of these literary criticism theories, approaches, or lenses have been adopted as ideologies, or have morphed into ideologies, or I suppose have been drawn down from the abstract into the world of action, right, and the world of behavior. And they have real world effects. So while this is to be expected, the danger is where there is a dogmatic or even a zealous espousing of a particular way of critiquing something. And this largely ends up being to the detriment and the ignoring of other perspectives. Balance is lost, okay? And there you see a story from the Irish Times, and there's many of these across the Western world, where well-known figures, literary figures, philosophical figures, scientific figures, or whatever the case may be, who have been celebrated with statues or with buildings or roads being named after them due to this person's alleged or apparent affiliation with the slave trade or with colonialism. That has begun to be seen through this lens as, quote, problematic, right? And many of these things have been pulled down and replaced. And this is as a result of looking at the world solely through a particular lens. And next we have the psychoanalytic criticism. And this form of literary criticism examines literature or media based on the psychological desires and neuroses of the characters within a particular piece of literature. Psychoanalytic critics believe that an author's unconscious thoughts are expressed through their work. And I suppose it's important to mention as well, I think I did a minute ago, but that the lenses you can use to interpret a piece of art or literature or a song, whatever, you can also apply that to society as well. A great example of a psychoanalytic idea is being explored through the media is the movie Inception. And there's a quote from the director of Inception, Christopher Nolan, and it says, "Nolan wanted to explore, quote, the idea of people sharing a dream space that gives you the ability to access somebody's unconscious mind. What would that be used and abused for?" So here is an example of a movie that leans into an exploration of the unconscious, which is the realm of the depth psychologists, Freud, Jung, Adler, Otto Rank. While this movie can be seen as a big screen offering of psychoanalytic ideas, that does not preclude it from being watched through different lenses. We could read it through a Marxist lens, where those who are attempting to plant an idea inside another's mind are equated with those in society who use their technology or their position, or their privilege, even that word is popular now, their privilege, to oppress others and control their worldview. So you can try on different hats with the same subject matter. Postmodernism. So postmodernist literary criticism emerged in the middle of the 20th century to reflect the fractured and dissonant experience of 20th century life. While there are many competing definitions of postmodernism, it is most commonly understood as rejecting modernist ideas of unified narrative. So I suppose you could phrase it this way. It objects to the monolithic view of what is good, what is moral, and what is the correct way of living your life in society, right? Across all layers or strata of a culture. It attacks monotheism, if you want to frame it in religious speak. And this has been perhaps the most dominant perspective taken in third level colleges. Again, if you've been through them, you'll be aware of this. Reader response criticism is rooted in the belief that a reader's reaction to or interpretation of a text is as valuable a source of critical study as the text itself. And we see this form of criticism becoming an ideology for many in these times, where total subjectivity is the order of the day, and the only measure of reality is a person's interpretation of events. The allure of this perspective when perceiving reality is that it elevates the individual's perspective to the summit of reality, right? It doesn't matter what's true, it matters how I feel about it, and that's the only thing that's true. And to a degree, there's merit in it. It's not a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's a merit in all of these approaches. It's just, it boils down to how you stack them, right? So hierarchically, which given in any given situation, which is the appropriate lens to take, right? And there's an intuition involved in understanding that, and that's up for each person alone, right? And again, there can be no wrong, as all views are as valued and valid as others, right? And we can see this being acted out in society now, where as long like you're here for a good time, not a long time, kind of a thing, right? Live your truth, right? Where everyone's interpretation and expression of their own attitude is just as morally valid as the next person's, right? And that's a decision that people can come to of their own accord, or it can be made for them, because these ideologies can become default settings in society. Moving towards more modern lenses that have been given to us, we have semiotics, and it's the study of signs. And this has experienced a great rise in interest since the 1990s, primarily through its application in the interpretation of literary texts and, by extension, culture. The role of semiotics in literary criticism is to establish key theoretical models that can provide insights so that the connection of the texts to broader meaning structures within literature practices can be better understood, right? So let us pull all available meaning from all available aspects of a text or of whatever it is you're looking at through the lens of semiotics, right? What is it trying to mean? What is it trying to say? What does it symbolize? And we see that the study of signs and symbols, which will allow for a deeper exploration of a text, a movie, a painting, or even society. The alert ear may hear the echoes of divination in this approach, and you might be right in that. Following on then from postmodernism, or coupled with it, we have deconstruction, and this is proposed by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. Deconstructionists pick apart a text's ideas or arguments, looking for contradictions that render any singular reading of a text impossible. And this sort of deconstructing things and pulling words and trying to separate words from their meanings can lead to all sorts of confusion. And we see this in contemporary society, where all of a sudden the question of what is a woman seems to be elevated to primary concern for people. Another very popular lens is the feminist critique. And an example of this is from MSN.com, and it's speaking about the American elections and Kamala Harris and against Donald Trump. And it says, quote, 8 years later, speaking following Hillary Clinton, 8 years later, Vice President Kamala Harris assumed the Democratic nomination following President Joe Biden's decision to withdraw from the race, meaning another woman was within striking distance of finally winning the White House. So look at the language that's being used here, that's been chosen here. of a woman winning the White House in this instance, for women and because she's a woman. So while there's nothing inherently useless or meaningless in having a certain allegiance or pride for your gender or in your gender, it is when that preference is held to be of the most important metric through which to support somebody, make decisions and treat ideas. Holding one allegiance to the detriment and denial of others is to not be playing with a full deck. It does not need to be explained to people that there are other factors at play here, especially in such a thing like a presidential race. So we have the economy, the philosophical differences, psychological, educational, the military differences and views on the military, and just the social differences. The fact that one person is a man and the other a woman should be low down on the deciding factors when dealing with something as salient as perhaps the most influential office in the Western world. This total adherence and loyalty, blind loyalty to only seeing things through a certain perspective and ignoring contradictions to that stance, right? That leads us to the world of cults, right? But when we hear of cults these days, we tend to think of like obvious lunacy, such as like the Jonestown cult or Scientology. So instead, let us get radical and meaning to go back to the roots, back to the definitions of things. And this is from Merriam-Webster Dictionary, and cult is defined as, in three ways, as a religion regarded as unorthodox or spurious, according to who would be the next question to that, right? Number two, a great devotion to a person, an idea, an object, movement or work, such as a film or book, especially. So such devotion regarded as a literary or intellectual fad, right? So falling into fashions and obeying the unwritten rules of these fashions, right? And number three, a system of religious beliefs and ritual. So again, it gives the example of the cult of Apollo, right? So all ancient customs, prior to and even leading into the beginning of the origins of Christianity, you could even call Christianity one itself, right? It had a load of different cults, different shrines, different temples, different ways of offering devotion or offering prayer to different divinities, right? It had a plethora of understanding of human nature, and that was embodied or explained or symbolized in these kind of characters, right? One kind of both co-creating each other. And in Ireland, this single vision was captured in Balor of the Evil Eye, who was the chief of the rivals to the Tuatha Dé Danann, who were held as the gods of Ireland. His single eye, making him a cyclops, would kill all that it cast its gaze to. The destructive side of being ideologically possessed or lacking balance and perspective is shown here in story form, right? So instead of just saying that is cult behavior, you're given a story of what this looks like in action. It fleshes it out, it amplifies up the meaning. And mythology is a story about a particular psychological tendency, or it can be, right? It's certainly one of the aspects to it. You also have many others. You can encode certain historical facts in it if you wish. You can, or you find even the stories of the zodiac, right? The constellations. You find different ways of capturing things in the world and showing them in story form instead of explicitly pulling them out and offering them as here is a fact. It's detailed in a story instead, right? Kids love stories, right? It's nearly the most natural way of conveying meaning and understanding of the world. But as we grow up, we need to learn, we need to dwell in the world of facts as well, and dates and times and all that historical stuff, right? But you need to balance that out too. So going even further back or deeper to the roots, because as we've seen over the last few years, the popularly held and agreed upon definitions of words can be changed on a whim, right? So it's important at times as well to look at the etymology of the word, right? So the history or the development of the word across an expanse of time, right? And this is from Etym Online, which is a handy little site, right? So cult, from 1610s, it meant to worship or to pay homage. In the 1670s, it was, quote, a particular form or system of worship. And this came from the Latin word cultus, which was to care or to labour, cultivation, culture, worship, reverence, originally meaning tended or cultivated. The word was rare after the 17th century, but it was revived in the mid-19th century with reference to ancient or primitive systems of religious belief and worship, especially the rites and ceremonies employed in such worship. Extended meaning devoted to attention to a particular person or thing is from 1829. So there's a shift, right? Instead of cult went from speaking of devotion, paying reverence, honouring across the board, to it meaning specific forms of worship, just not Christianity, right? And obviously, like, the history works that way, right? So the dominant power portrays itself in the most favourable of lights. Of course, this is natural, right? So a person who is part of a cult is simply one who worships a certain thing, an idea, an idol, a thing, a person, perhaps themselves even, the cult of themselves, right? One who cares for, adores, or to follow a specific religious practice or belief. And religion then is an interesting word, because we feel like as people we've moved beyond religion, and religion no longer applies to anything we do anymore. But again, go back to definitions, right? So religion, this is by the Britannica, quote, religion, human beings' relation to that which they regard as holy, sacred, absolute, spiritual, divine, or worthy of special reverence. One need not only be speaking of gods here, for one can be religious about their worldview, which is that which they seek to elevate to primary importance, the absolute, the pinnacle, the most fundamental and the most aspirational of ideas. That is their God. You could probably go and find a never-ending supply of these lenses, and there are more, but I'm sure the point has been made. And if we do not care to grasp this intellectually, then one can see these in action. We see and we hear of reparations, equity, positive discrimination, tearing down of statues, and the demonization and racial guilt tripping of the white race. These are all results of adhering to and zealously espousing a particular worldview or a particular interpretation of reality. It has real world consequences, and we can reverse engineer it into what that says about the mind of the person who follows this sort of worldview. So we can apply the lens to the lens of another person, right? One final one then, because I think this is probably going to be one foundational in what's coming with the exploration of Irish mythology. They'll all be used in part, right? But this is a fascinating one, and it's archetypal psychology, or archetypal perspective. And quote, this is from James Hillman, who was one of the pioneers of archetypal psychology following Carl Jung. And he says, quote, by traditional definition, archetypes are the primary forms that govern the psyche, the seasons in the very soul of man, since they manifest as well in physical, social, linguistic, aesthetic, and spiritual modes. He continues, its first links are with culture and imagination rather than with medical and empirical psychologies. So instead of looking at what the thing is, we'll be looking at archetypal psychology, would look at what it means, right? And there's a difference. It's one thing to say it is now winter. It's a different thing to describe what your relationship with winter is, what winter means to you, what images winter conjures up in your mind, right? There's a difference in aesthetics even. There's a difference in emotion attached to it. There's a difference in feeling to the different perspectives. This lens is not focused on dates and times, but instead on the moods of different ages. And we can understand this because we have different ages, right? So in America, it's far more obvious probably, because it tended to be the incubator, or the petri dish of a lot of these sort of fads and fashions, right? So you had hippies, you'd have bikers, you'd have the age of grunge, right? All these sorts of things, the 80s, the big hair, punk age, all that sort of stuff. These are all fashions that resulted from a particular mood either being artificially created in an age or drawn out and expressed in a particular age. And you can, I don't even know if we have these anymore, do we? These different fads or these different ages. So yeah, I'll read that again. So yep. This lens is not focused on dates and times, but instead on the moods of different ages, and how man captured or was captured by them, and how he expressed the mood of his age in morality, in action, in arts, in combat, and in rulership. That is what mythology can capture more profoundly than any history book can. Hillman spoke of a polytheistic psychology, and people of monotheistic or Christian society or culture might kind of have a knee-jerk response to that and think paganism, paganism, get rid of it, right? But let's mature here a little bit. So if monotheism, and we looked at religion, so religion is like whatever somebody holds to be the absolutely most important thing, and if monotheism then would be a way of looking at the world that only focuses on one paramount trait of existence, then polytheism would be a way of looking at the world that attempts to account for, explore, and perhaps celebrate a multitude of perspectives in the world with no real primacy, right? Everything gets equal weight and measure and attention. And this is from Hillman again. He says about polytheism, quote, "Of all the moves, none is so far-reaching in cultural implication as the attempt to recover the perspectives of polytheism." Right? So how did they experience the world back then when this would have been the default perception of reality, right? Fascinating stuff. To Hillman, the most accurate model of human nature must account for innate diversity in attitudes and types, for we know these things exist, right? The word diversity has often been tainted, if not outright poisoned, by modern usage here, but we know this, that there's a diversity between individual to individual. People are different, right? They have different tendencies. Some are more practical, others are away with the fairies and dreamy in nature. You know, some are highly intellectual and want to speak about things totally factually, pick it apart, reconstruct it, reverse engineer it. And then we have the dreamers, right? Or the emotionally profound people who feel, who experience the world through their feeling, right? That's how they interact with things, through the realm of feeling, where things are, they mean things, they matter to them, right? They upset them wickedly, they move them profoundly. That sort of stuff. We know that this exists, right? It's not controversial or anything. He says it must also provide fundamental structures and values for this diversity. So he's speaking about an accurate model of human nature. It must account for this diversity, right? In other words, you cannot force one size fits all model onto all people unless you have something that undergirds or underpins the diversity and perspective. He says a polytheistic psychology is necessary for reawakening reflective consciousness and bringing a new reflection to psychopathology. What does he mean by that? So in order to begin to make a little bit more sense of the world we're in, ourselves as human beings, what man is in general, what the relationship between life and life and man and death is, all that sort of stuff. Why do we create things? Why do we desire to express ourselves? Why does expressing ourselves lead to good health, that sort of thing, or to a better relationship with our oneself? What is truth? This sort of thing. And he suggests that the deeper and wider our ability to interpret existence is, the less sick we will become, the less mentally unhealthy we will be. So, by beginning to break apart the iron mask we have worn and awakening to different parts of ourselves, we may heal the suffering in ourselves and impart, if you're this way inclined, to your nation. Hillman finally suggests that it is not enough simply to label and categorize one's worldview, such as I'm a liberal or I'm a traditionalist. One must cultivate, and there's that word again, cult. One must cultivate a relationship with the myriad of perspectives that all are capable of adorning. As with the Greeks, Romans, and other, quote, pagans and barbarians, we must be capable of caring for a multitude of perspectives and be interested in them, explore them, while also grounding them in something that structures these perspectives. The main thrust of archetypal psychology is how self-centeredness, or a great modern term, main character syndrome, right? How that can destroy one's ability to experience anything differently or anything different. With that, I've shown several different ways of framing and explaining the world. And I've done this by offering areas of scholarship that are in the academic world and in mainstream references like Masterclass or Wikipedia. As I stated at the outset, the purpose in this was to show that when we begin to examine and study Irish mythology using these different lenses or perspectives, we remain on solid ground logically and on reasonable grounding too. We're not straying far into the wilderness here. Any claim that we are talking nonsense or are engaging in mystical talk will be the claim of ignorance and the claim of an ignorant person and nothing more. We will see how one lens can lead to another and to another until we have drawn from many different fields and have extracted meanings from the tales that far exceed the simple words we find on the page. Instead, we will plunge ourselves into the deep waters of what the words symbolize. We have for too long been mired in the swamp of monotheism. It has frozen and limited our minds and our imaginations. So let us begin to relate to our history, the Irish story, or your own, regardless of where you're from, or irrespective of where you're from, with a wider and deeper perspective. And that's what I will be doing next. I will be beginning to close read and pull the implicit meaning and the symbolic qualities and values from Irish mythology. I hope you'll join me.